Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So Election Day is Monday, and today we've got a different kind of episode for you. At the start of the campaign, we asked the three major federal party leaders for one-on-one interviews. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole's team responded but declined, and we never heard back from Liberal leader Justin Trudeau. But this week, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh did get back to us. I caught up with him while he was on his way from Toronto to Oshawa. He was on his campaign bus, as you'll hear in the sound quality, and here is that conversation. You're listening to The Decibel. Mr. Singh, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we have 20 minutes. I have a lot of questions, not a lot of time for chit chat, unfortunately, so I'll just get right into it.
Let's do it.
So you're someone who understands how to speak to young people. You're all over social media. You have a massive presence on TikTok. I saw that you just started an island on Animal Crossing recently.
I did.
Young people are notoriously unreliable when it comes to turning up at the polls. You know, there's no polling stations on campuses because of the pandemic. And I wonder, can you tell young voters your top reason to show up and vote for you on Election Day?
I'm a fighter, and I fought for people in the pandemic, and I will fight for you in the recovery. And really, there's a choice for progressives and for people who want to see a brighter future. And Mr. Trudeau has shown that he's all for show, and he's protected the interests of the super rich. I am committed to making the billionaires and the multimillionaires and the super wealthy pay their fair share to invest in people. I will fight for you, and I'll fight for better housing, better healthcare, fight for the environment, and fight for your futures.
I want to ask you about something that I can't help but notice anytime I hear you speak, and it's the way that you talk. So to me, you sound like anyone I grew up with in Scarborough, which is actually where you were born. You don't sound like any of the other candidates. You really lean into that casual, informal way of speaking. And have you ever felt that someone isn't taking you seriously because of that? Do you ever feel like you should code switch?
I want to be accessible. So if I'm speaking to the kids, I'm going to speak to kids at a level which makes sense to kids. But for me, I just want to connect with the person I'm speaking with. And so I just find the best way that I can convey what I care about, hear what they care about, and just speak to people, person to person from my heart. And that means, speaking in the way that is easiest for that person to absorb and receive. And I love connecting with people. So I always want to find ways to have a stronger connection. I have to say, it's kind of cool that you noticed that. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So when you became the first elected racialized leader of a federal party, we heard a lot about the kind of racist abuse that you experienced on the campaign trail. And I'm curious, what has your experience been like this time around?
There's always challenges that I face. And I don't like to focus on my own challenges. I'm in a really special position that I've been a lawyer for a number of years. I've been a regional politician, and I'm a leader. So I have experiences that give me an ability to respond to those challenges. But I just think about people that go through this every day. Maybe I understand a bit of what people go through because I've experienced a bit of it. But I also want to say I'm really thankful and honored that maybe despite those prejudices, that people across the country have seen us as fighters that believe in me and believe in work that we're doing to make life better for folks, that they do think that we're going to do what we say. And that to me is a huge honor. And I'm really thankful for the incredible support that I'm getting.
Mm-hmm. How much of a factor do you think racism still is in this campaign? Like, are people more open to electing a brown man who wears a turban?
I think so. I really believe people are ready for it. I've seen a lot of folks that are saying, hey, you know what? I voted for other parties in the past, but I want to vote for you now. I'm going to do it. Lots of folks have come up to me and have already voted. So I believe that people are there. I don't want to in any way underestimate that in any way that systemic racism has been dealt with. It's still there. It exists.
One of the challenges of being Prime Minister in Canada is that it's a federation. Each region is so different. One part of the country wants to go one way, the other wants to go another way. How would you balance the competing priorities between the provinces and the territories?
Well, I wouldn't ignore the fact that there are competing differences, and there are unique challenges that people face in the north that are very different from what people face in urban centers in the south of Canada. Atlantic experiences for those provinces are very different from the West Coast. And so I would accept and acknowledge those regional differences. But at the same time, I would also lean into the fact that there are a lot of similarities. Like when we talked about making the billionaires pay their fair share, companies like Amazon that make record profits, they don't pay any taxes here, to get them to start paying their fair share. That is something widely supported by Canadians. When we talk about investing in healthcare to ensure that your medication costs are included in the healthcare system, that's something that's widely popular and supported by people. And so a lot of what we're pushing for are things that everyone agrees. The housing crisis used to be maybe a concern more so for major cities like Toronto or Vancouver. But now we're hearing from people in rural communities who are saying, we can't afford to find a place to buy or a place that's in our budget to rent. So there are more and more challenges that are kind of putting people together, workers together, the middle class together, and they're seeing the billionaires enjoying this incredible opportunity to make wealth while they're been struggling and making sacrifices. And really that's bringing people together to say, well, we can change that. We don't have to accept things this way. We can make things better. And that's what I'm offering.
Okay, let's take a specific example of where regional interests clash. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline project. It's good for Alberta's economy, bad for reaching our emission targets. People want to know how you'd move forward on it. If you became prime minister, you said you'd take stock of the situation, but you have refused to say whether or not you'd cancel the pipeline. And I want to know why you haven't answered this question.
Well, there's a lot of things that we need to do to fight the climate crisis. And so for people to make an informed decision, they should know where I stand on the environment. And I've laid out a host of measures that I would do immediately. We would immediately stop the fossil fuel subsidies that Mr. Trudeau promised to end, but instead of ending has increased by 900 million. We would ensure that the biggest polluters are included in the price on pollution, despite being exempted by Mr. Trudeau. So we've laid out where we stand on the environment, and I've been opposed to this project from the beginning. And folks should know that that's where I stand. I always said that we should never purchase it. I've always said that this is not a project that I support. And folks know where I stand and what I would do moving forward. That's important for people to know.
So does that mean you would cancel it if you were prime minister?
On this particular project, I really believe in making good decisions that are prudent decisions, that are thoughtful decisions. So there's some things that we don't know about until we're in government. This is one of those. We need to know the details before we make a decision.
Don't we know everything that we already need to know about this pipeline? What would you want to weigh when you're making that decision?
We just want to understand where we're at and what would it cost to Canadians? What would the impact be to Canadians?
Can you give me any more specifics? Like what kind of information?
Just the details about the asset and what Mr. Trudeau has done.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I haven't seen any specifics in your platform about how the NDP plans to prepare Canadians for the realities of climate change. So there are a lot of promises about how we're going to reach our emissions targets, et cetera. But, we've had hundreds of people die in BC during the heat wave because they didn't have air conditioning. We've been hearing about how we need to be ready for more frequent and intense wildfires and flooding. So what are you going to do to protect people from the effects of climate change?
We made an announcement a couple of weeks ago that a new Democrat government, we would put in place a $1.5 billion fund that would allow municipalities to access it to have proactive steps in place to prevent some of the impacts of the extreme weather. Because we know exactly what you're saying, we need to put in place some investments, some infrastructure investments, so that communities are more resilient. We know that with extreme weather, the forest fires are more intense, are longer, and there's ways for communities to put in place different steps ahead of time instead of responding to a crisis, but being proactive. That includes mitigation of forest fire spread. That includes putting perimeter infrastructure around communities so they can be prevented from being impacted as harshly. It also means for communities that are being impacted by rising water levels, putting in place proactive steps around that potential eventuality. So we put forward a significant fund that municipalities could access to make those decisions and to be proactive in preventing the outcomes that we've seen and to save lives.
Okay, so let's talk about the housing crisis in this country, which you mentioned just a little while ago. So all the experts that we've spoken to say the lack of supply is one of the main drivers of ever-increasing home prices, and the NDP promises to build 500,000 units of affordable housing over the next 10 years. how do you define an affordable housing unit?
Well, we also think, though, we need to get rid of some of the pressures that are driving up the cost of housing. So some of the speculative forces, which come from foreign investment, come from speculators, house flippers, we want to disincentivize that by changing the capital gains tax. But in terms of how we get to the new units of 500,000 plus retrofitting and remediating the previous ones, that's 1.2 million. So our goal is 1.7 million in total. To do that, it would take a number of different steps. We would invest massively in the construction of cooperative housing, not-for-profit housing. We would invest in building homes that are within people's budgets. We would waive the GST for homes that are affordable. And in terms of what is affordable, well, we certainly know that half of people's salaries is not affordable. And that's what a lot of people are spending on their housing. Some of the metrics have been 20% of a person's salary. That's within reason. So for me, affordability is being able to afford a home that still allows you to put some money aside for savings, to still pay your bills, and to still be able to have all the things that you need to be able to live a good life.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned this foreign buyers tax, and experts have said that that's not one of the main drivers of surging home prices. And so, like, for millennials who are looking to get into the market, what are you going to do about the fact that it's kind of the Wild West, and there are investors with deep pockets that are buying and flipping homes and driving up prices that way?
Yeah, so I would say that we've seen a cooling effect of putting in a foreign buyers tax in BC. It worked to cool the market. So it is part of the solution, but not at all the only solution. The other thing, to get at that property flipping and that speculation that's driving up the cost of homes, what we're proposing is changes to the capital gains tax. Right now, the inclusion is 50%. We'd increase that to 75%. And in doing that, it would get at it would disincentivize the ability to just flip homes and make more money. Kind of like what we saw with one of the Liberal candidates in Granville, who's alleged to have flipped over 40 times property flipped homes and made millions of dollars in profit. We want to disincentivize that. We want to discourage that. We want the housing market not to be used like a stock market. We want it to be about people finding a place to call home.
Let's go back to the affordable housing units for a moment. So you mentioned cooperative housing, for example. So what tools does the federal government have to help that actually happen?
Well, the CMHC used to be involved. It's a federal private corporation that's invests in housing, and it used to be very active in securing funding for communities that were that wanted to build cooperatives. It used to be one of the major drivers to build cooperatives. And around the 90s, the federal government stopped being involved in building housing in the same way. And from the 90s to present is when we've seen a really skyrocketing in the cost of living when it comes to finding a home that's in your budget, whether it's buying or renting. And so we want to get back into investing massively in cooperatives, not-for-profits, and housing in general. We also have another tool where, to prevent people from being rent evicted, the CMHC approves loans when developers or builders want to renovate homes. We would create strict criteria that CMHC loans cannot be approved or used in cases where the homes would not be affordable. We'd have strict affordability criteria. There's a lot that the federal government can do. There's a lot of tools at our disposal. What we've seen over the past number of decades with Liberals and Conservatives is that they haven't used them to tackle the housing crisis. They haven't had the courage to do so, even though the capacity or the ability has been there.
I want to ask you a question about strategic voting, and I feel like this is probably a question that you get all the time. So the Liberals have introduced a bunch of pretty progressive policies over the course of the pandemic, and they're promising more. And there are so many NDP supporters who end up voting strategically for the Liberals because they have a better shot at forming government. So how do you convince them that they don't have to be worried about the Conservatives being in power if they vote NDP? Because that's a real fear.
Well, two things. We talk about the price that people end up paying for the promises that Mr. Trudeau has broken. He campaigned not too long ago, just 2 years ago, on farming care, promised it, said it's one of his hallmark promises in the last election. Then put it in his throne speech, again, promised it. At the first opportunity to vote on it, he voted against it, teaming up with Mr. O'Toole to vote against it. So that's a cost that people end up paying, a price that people pay, because People that expected that their medication would be covered are now still spending thousands of dollars on medication that should have been included. We also are going to let Canadians who are thinking about this choice think about what you get with Mr. Trudeau. Someone who's all for show, who has protected the interests of the super rich, or with you Democrats, you get a fighter, someone who's going to fight for you. When it comes to people who need more help, you Democrats have fought for them. In the pandemic, the Liberals wanted to do the minimum. They wanted a 10% wage subsidy. They only wanted CERB at $1,000. We doubled CERB. We increased the wage subsidy to 75%. We brought in paid sick leave. We brought in help for students. Without New Democrats, people wouldn't have got the help they needed. So with us, you get fighters, someone on your side. So if you want someone to fight for the climate, you want someone to fight for better housing, fight for better investments in our healthcare, that's New Democrats. The Liberals won't do it unless New Democrats are elected. More of us elected means more help to people.
The Liberals, for example, are promising a $10 a day childcare policy, which is the exact same thing that you've promised. And I wonder if that's enough to keep those people voting strategically. Like, what policies do you have that are more ambitious than what the Liberals have offered?
Well, first, our plan is not the same. The Liberals promised to get this done 30 years ago, and it took them 30 years. So what that shows the Canadians is the Liberals will take 30 years to get things done. And they kind of have this strategy of why deliver on something when we can just campaign on it anyways. So that's very different. We don't believe in that. We believe in results right away. But the major difference is, instead of hypotheticals, I'll put to listeners 3 concrete things. We believe that one of the worst things in this pandemic, lots of folks agree, is that our long-term care and our residents and loved ones in long-term care bore the brunt of the pandemic. And one of the most clear things was that for-profit long-term care centers were the worst. We said we would remove profit from long-term care. Both Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole voted against removing the profit and the greed from long-term care, making it clear they're in favor of for-profit long-term care delivery. That was their vote in Parliament. We said we should tax the billionaires, companies like Amazon. We should close the loopholes like the offshore tax havens, and that we should put a wealth tax on the extremely wealthy. That's something we believe should happen. Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole voted against that, again, siding with the ultra-rich. When it came to pharmacare, like I mentioned, we put that to a vote, and Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole both voted against it, protecting rich pharmaceutical companies, hurting people. So really, we can show very clearly how we're different. We are for the people. We want to tax the ultra-rich. Mr. Trudeau has shown that he's protected the interests of the super-rich.
So just on the tax question, so much of the NDP's platform relies on revenue from increasing taxes on the ultra-rich. And you mentioned this. I wonder if you want to unpack it a little bit more. How are you going to enforce our tax laws better than previous governments?
A really important question. And we looked at the Parliamentary Budget Office's analysis that every year, because of the corporate loopholes and the tax havens and other loopholes that are used by the ultra-wealthy, that the Parliamentary Budget Office concluded that we are losing $25 billion a year of revenue. So over the 6 years that Mr. Trudeau has been in office, they concluded that's $146 billion of revenue that have been lost. What we've also found is that the civil servants, the folks that work in enforcing this, have said we are under-resourced and understaffed and haven't been given the mandate to go after these tax cheats and these tax evaders. If we were given that mandate, we could have. So in the 6 years that Mr. Trudeau has been in office, not a single tax evader has been prosecuted, despite the numerous Panama paper-like documents that were released showing Canadians that were tax evading with massive amounts of wealth. So what we're saying is we would invest significant resources, $100 million, into the CRA with a specific mandate of going after the ultra-rich, going after the tax evaders, going after the folks in the Panama Papers. These aren't someone with a 3-car garage and a Peloton. We're talking about the ultra-rich, those at the very, very top. So we would do that. We would put in laws that would make it clear that tax havens are not allowed. There are Canadian companies that use them to hide paying their fair share. We would also put in a wealth tax on fortunes of over 10 million. So if someone's got a fortune of 50 million, they would then on the 40 million pay a 1% tax. So these are real concrete measures that would answer the question, who pays for the pandemic? It would not be you or your families. It would not be workers, the middle class. We are the only party saying it should be the super wealthy that pay their fair share to invest in people.
So we've seen Erin O'Toole going after working class voters, which is traditionally the NDP's turf. He seems to think they're vulnerable. He has a platform aimed at helping gig workers. He's talking about the drop in union memberships and his speeches. What message do you have for working class people who are thinking of voting Conservative?
Well, we know where Mr. O'Toole stands. He was a minister with the Harper government who attacked workers and made it harder for workers. And all the things that matter, he teamed up with Mr. Trudeau to vote against pharmacare. Pharmacare would help workers. He teamed up to vote against getting profit out of long-term care. That doesn't help workers. That helps the super rich owners of for-profit long-term care centers, which are profitable, wealthy corporations. And he made it clear that he wouldn't put the burden on the billionaires and the super rich by voting against our motion to tax the super rich. So he's shown that he is definitely on the side of the ultra rich as opposed to being on the side of workers. And he's shown that with his actions. We've been really clear. If you want someone on your side, if you're a worker, if you're middle class, it's us, Democrats, that have got your back.
So a lot of times...
Can I pause you 1 second? Are you saying like right now, hard out, or are you saying that I can finish up a bit more?
Okay. Just one more question. All right. So a lot of times in the last stretch of a campaign, we lose sight of the bigger picture and we get caught up in the race. And I wanted to give you a chance right now to tell us your vision of the future. What does Canada look like in the year 2040 under an NDP government?
Wow, I love this question. I'm so glad that we didn't wrap it up. We would be making the billionaires pay their fair share. So we would invest in a healthcare system that covers you from head to toe. That includes dental care and mental health. This would be covered in our healthcare system so that workers don't have to worry about having the right job and the right benefit to have these protections in place. We would make sure that we invest in creating an economy that helps us fight the climate crisis, but with good paying jobs. And so people would have good jobs that help us fight the climate crisis. We would invest in renewable energy, retrofitting homes and buildings, and in electrified transportation so that we are leaders in the world for renewable energy, and also we've lowered our emissions. We would invest in our education system so that young people don't have to be saddled with the burden of debt, and that education is included from kindergarten to post-secondary, that there's no barrier, it's tuition free. We can build a better world, really a world that comes down to everyone paying their fair share, and a world where we lift each other up by taking better care of each other. Long-term care that is not for profit, that it is delivering care that puts patients and residents first, and a world where people can live their best lives by knowing that we're taking better care of each other.
Okay, Mr. Singh, thank you so much for coming on the Decibel.
Thanks so much. That was awesome.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. And just a reminder that Monday is Election Day, so make sure you go vote. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.